Welcome to Tanach Study in Sefer Study. I'm Nachliel Selavan, and this is Archaeology Snapshot for Chumash Bemidbar, Sefer Bemidbar, the fourth book of Chamisha Chumashei Torah. Our goal for each Sefer is to cover the following questions. When is it happening? Who are the main players? Where are they located? With some highlights from history and archaeology. This is a beautiful map from the Koren Chumash Yisrael. And I highly recommend using the new Chumash Yisrael, which comes either in 1 or 5 volumes, because of the appendixes in the end, which include maps like this one, and beautiful charts, lists of words, and all kinds of other useful learning material, as well as lists of materials, flora, and fauna, which are relevant to each Chumash, by experts in the field, colorful, beautiful, nice to use, elucidated. Now, when it comes to maps, I would like to introduce a new map for this chapter, for this video, which is the Herzog New HaTanach website, which is now available in Spanish and previously in English and in Hebrew. Now, before we go any further to discuss this map, I would just like to mention that I have made 2 tutorials that explain how to use this map properly, one in Hebrew, one in English, and I am going to link the map as well as those 2 tutorial videos in the description to this video, so I hope you take a look at it. Now, there are a couple ways that you can divide the Sefer into either 2 parts or into 3 parts. I'm going to divide it into 3 because it's more easy to work with in terms of the geography and the archaeology relevant to the Chumash. So we have here in the Tanach website several different options for where Har Sinai or Har Horev is. The way to do that is explained very clearly in the video, so I'm going to refer you to the tutorial video. Now, the first part of the Sefer basically is from the 2nd year. So we've left Mitzrayim, we've crossed Yam Suf in this location by the Suez Canal, and we've made our way to Har Horev, Har Sinai, and this is a discussion we're not going to have now about which of the locations is Har Sinai, but this is happening in the 2nd year now. So we're talking about Chanukat HaMishkan, we're talking about the encampment, we are preparing to go into Eres Yisrael. Of course, this is before everything goes south and pretty much stays in the south for about 38 years. And so this is the first part of the Chumash. The second part of the Chumash begins with the Meraglim pretty much going up into Eretz Canaan. I mean, you can sort of take it back further with the tlunot, with the complaints, but the point is that the second part deals with all the wanderings and stories and doings of Bnei Yisrael in the Midbar. Many of these events don't have any particular date. So this is Kadesh Barnea, Midbar Tzin, not to be confused with Midbar Sinai. This is Midbar Tzin, and this is where we enter Eretz Canaan, enter the land, and basically go into the next 38 years of many different stories of Bnei Yisrael in the desert. The third and last part of Chumash Sefer Bemidbar has to do with getting close to Eretz Canaan, as the Torah says, El Ketze Eretz Noshavet, we're getting close to settled, civilized land, and we start encountering the various nations in the south and the east of Eretz Yisrael and the Jordan. We have the nations in the south, Edom, Ammon, Moab, and then we have Sichon and Og Melech HaBashan in the north. We have the Yerusha, the Nachalah, the inheritance, conquest of that particular area, inherited by the 2.5 tribes, Reuven, Gad, and half of Menashe. And finally, we arrive at the plains of Moab, Arvot Moab, Mul Yarden Yericho, which is where the Chumash ends, and where we're really setting the stage for Moshe Rabbeinu's speech at the end of his life, which is, of course, what Chumash Devarim is all about. Now, our first highlight has to do with the Mahane and the Degalim. What is exactly the encampment? What exactly are the banners? Now, in Chumash Shmot, we spoke about the comparison, based on Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman's Ani Ma'amin book, between the encampment of Ramses the Great in the Battle of Kadesh to the Mahane. We spoke about the architecture, and that's taken from the temple, which you see in the background, the temple of Abu Simbel. So let's look closely at this picture. This is an image from Olam HaTanach, but this is found also in Joshua Berman's book. It's very, very famous, and it shows you in the center the main architecture of the traveling temple of Ramses the Great. Now, in addition to the traveling temple, there are other similarities which have to do with the way his army camped around this traveling portable temple, which is basically a Mahane tabernacle. It's a portable mikdash, and that's something important to note, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But the comparison between the two, which comes from architecture, is uncanny and needs to be taken into consideration. And again, that's what Joshua Berman talks about. It's a fascinating conversation. But before we go in to talk about that, I would like to introduce a very important synagogue, which is one of my favorite synagogues to talk about, which relates to Jewish history and art, and that is the Dura Europos Synagogue. You heard that, Dura Europos. The Dura Europos Synagogue is from the 3rd century, less than 50 years after the writing of the Mishnah, and this synagogue is on the Euphrates River in modern-day Syria, a city which was actually, unfortunately, destroyed by ISIS in the year 2013, and that included the destruction of the original building of the synagogue. But lucky for us, the entire synagogue, with all of its beautiful paintings, were brought into the National Museum in Damascus, where they stand until today. Now, the Dura Europos Synagogue is very important in terms of Jewish history because it's an example of Jewish art. In other words, Jews painting and being creative and decorative in synagogues, which until very recently not believed to have taken place. And yet the Dura Europos Synagogue, which was ignored, it's been around for almost 100 years since its discovery in the late 1920s, early 1930s, has dozens and dozens of paintings from stories throughout Tanach. And we're going to get back to Dura Europos several times throughout this series and another one time in this particular video. The first painting I want to show you is that of Moshe Rabbeinu presumably hitting the rock with the water streaming out towards all of the 12 tents which are encamped around him. With the Mishkan in the back, you can see, sort of in the front, with the menorah, and the 12 different tents represent the 12 tribes, the 12 Shvatim. This is a depiction of the 12 tribes around a center, and this is a colorful, beautiful painting from the earliest synagogue painting in the world. Isn't that cool? Now let's talk about the camping around the Mishkan. So I mentioned that there was the encampment of Paro, Ramses the Great's battle encampment around the centering portable Mishkan of his, and that's very important to understand in terms of traveling and movement and connecting that to battle, but we're going to get to that in our next highlight. But what I want to point out is what exactly is a degel. We usually think of a degel like this picture from Olam HaTanach, kind of like a flag. Now, the word flag may be related to what a banner or a degel was back in the day in terms of the purpose that it served, but what a degel actually is, or degalim or otot, is more of a banner which was used particularly to identify a unit or a group, a formation in battle. So this is an example from the New Kingdom on the right. These are Nubian soldiers holding a standard with an image of 2 wrestling men, which was just the particular ot, or degel, of this group. And on the left we have a Roman battle formation also with a particular banner. We're going to get back to battle formations and the mobilization of battle formations because this is all part of the Mahane and all part of the Mishkan traveling with the Aron as if it is a battle formation. So that's really, really cool. But I also want to mention that a find of Jewish ostraca, Jewish writing that is, from the time of the Persian period, which is the early Second Temple period, mentioned a degel in the sense of a unit of some sort. Degel Abdani is the name, but that's a family of Abed, Abedani, like Eved Hashem or something like that. But degel there actually means a unit, like an army unit or a group or a unit. So the word degel actually does not mean flag. It's more like a banner which represents a particular group. That's kind of cool. But now we're going to move on to the Aron. When we speak about traveling with the Aron, this is a very important detail about the Aron, which is that the Aron actually goes into battle. As we say when we open the Holy Ark and bring out the Sefer Torah, we'll get to that in a moment. But we left Midbar Sinai. This is an image from Olam HaTanach, which has beautiful pictures. It's a picture of Midbar Sinai, Midbar Horev, and let's move on to those psukim. So when we open up the Sefer Torah, we say these psukim from our Chumash, Vayhi bin Tzoa Ha'aron Vayomer Moshe, Kuma Hashem v'yafutzu oyevecha, v'yanusu misaneecha mipanecha. When the ark set out, Moshe would say, advance, O God, may your enemies be scattered, and may your foes flee before you. And so we look at the Aron as something which is carried, in this case carried on the shoulders of the Kohanim in front of Bnei Yisrael in battle. And the imagery of the Aron is that of a battle. Now, if you've seen Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know that that's exactly why the Nazis are after it. But the truth is that the Aron was not only in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, it was actually used to travel into war, into battle, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But traveling with a wooden ark plated with gold, which is what the Aron was basically made of, it's Atzei Shittim plated in gold, was known from Egyptian ceremonies and processions as seen in this picture. And as we discussed in Chumash Shmot, we have seen similarities of a particular wooden and gold-covered ark from the treasures of King Tut. And so this is a very important imagery that we have, which has to do with traveling with an aron on your shoulders in procession. So that's kind of cool. But I'd like to take you, of course, to Durei Ropus. Now, the Durei Ropus synagogue, again, in Syria from the 3rd century, a beautiful example of the aron being carried into battle by the Kohanim, presumably. Now, this is the story of the Battle of Even HaEzel. The Battle of Even HaEzel, which hopefully we will get to in Shmuel Aleph, is when the aron was taken out of Shiloh before Shiloh's destruction in the battle against Plishtim, and in which the aron was captured and taken into Philistine territory. And by the way, they also have that painting too. I'm going to stick to this one because look at how it depicts Jews as whatever it is 3rd century warriors looked like, with a chain of mail and swords and shields. It's really cool, and you see the battle ensuing, but you see the Kohanim presumably carrying the aron in battle formation, really just an aron, some sort of case, being carried on the shoulder by the Kohanim. And carrying the aron on your shoulders is a very important component of how the aron needs to be handled. Now, in order to mobilize this travel, you need to have some sort of mechanism for conveying messages across very large distances. And for that we have make these 2 silver trumpets in order to mobilize and to move these battle formations. Now, the usage of trumpets was known from antiquity. There is the trumpet from the treasure of King Tut, which I mentioned in the podcast, Parashat Terumah, where I spoke about King Tut, but also in Roman battle formations. I mean, this is before walkie-talkies and definitely before smartphones. You need to have a way to communicate across distance with large groups, and so having a trumpet is very useful. Now, I'm going to get into some archaeology, which is really fascinating. I'm going to get into some details from archaeology which are fascinating. This coin is from the Bar Kokhba revolt. It's a silver coin depicting 2 silver trumpets, which was struck on a Roman coin, probably from Emperor Hadrian, by Bar Kokhba. And it says on it in ancient Hebrew, Lecherut Yerushalayim, for the liberation of Jerusalem. And the reason that it has temple vessels on it, as many of them did, is because they had hopes of restoring the temple. Which temple? Well, this is most recently after the Second Temple. And the Chatzotzot from the Second Temple are depicted beautifully and most likely in color in the famous procession depicted in carving on the Arch of Titus, which was erected shortly after the procession actually took place. Now, this procession is most famously known for its menorah, which was used as the menorah for the state of Israel. And there's a whole story around that, which I hope to get into when we talk about it in Zechariah. But in any event, the reconstruction of the color was done by my professor Stephen Fine in Yeshiva University, where they actually used the known color palette of the Roman world to sort of guess what these colors may have been. And they looked with special scanners at the menorah, and they discovered that it is actually yellow. But I would like to focus actually on the little shulchan with the 2 little cups of levona on the top and the 2 silver chatzotzot inside. This is an image from closely after the destruction of the temple, made by an artist who may have even seen them, depicting what the chatzotzot kesef of the Beit HaMikdash looked like. But let's make this even cooler, because we found the station where the chatzotzot were used. And this place was called Bet HaTkiah. This is an image from a video of Megalim Institute, Machon Megalim of the City of David National Park, their educational institution, and it shows you a Kohen standing with a silver trumpet on the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount, of the Second Temple. And the reason we know that that's where there was a Bet HaTkiah, that's where there was a station for trumpets, is because we found the stone. After the destruction of the temple, the stone collapsed and fell down, and we actually found it, and it says on it in words that if you look carefully, you will be able to read, and that is Levet HaTkiah, for the trumpeting station, and the next word is either Lehavdil, in other words, the trumpets were there to tell you when is Shabbat, when is Chol, and so on, or Lehachriz, to make announcements. In either event, this is really cool. Next highlight. If there's one thing you know about Jews, it's that we love to complain. And what is it that we complain about? Well, obviously, we complain about food. And unlike the dolphins in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, we did not say so long and thanks for all the fish. We complained about the fact that we don't have any more fish to eat. Now, why fish? Because we're coming from Egypt. Egypt, which was largely on the Nile or by the ocean, lived on fish. Fish was a very, very important part of the Egyptian diet. And so these passages about our complaints actually have a lot of value for the study of ancient Egypt. So here's just one carving from the Old Kingdom, from the time of the pyramids, showing you Egyptians on a boat capturing lots of fish in a net. But next on, these beautiful paintings, which are copies of original paintings that are still in Egypt, are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Egyptian Gallery, and they show you how fishing was part of Egyptian lifestyle. Let's move on to the next part we're complaining about. Kishuim, avatichim, chatzir, betzalim, shumim, all sorts of melons and leeks and gourds and garlic and so on. Now, if there's a name that you need to know when it comes to the study of botany, of Tanach, that is Professor Yehuda Felix. He's the name was always going to come up. Now, these pictures are taken from the end of the Yisrael Chumash, which I mentioned in the beginning, but there are many different discussions about what exactly are these particular melons, leeks, and garlic and onions and so on. But these are very common in the Egyptian diet and the Egyptian agriculture. It's important to know which exactly is which. Don't be fooled by the modern use of the word kishu and avatiach to think it means zucchini and watermelon. Not necessarily. Which kind of melon did they use? What is the word cucumber even come from? There's a lot to discuss. I'm not going into it. I just think it's very cool. But let's take pictures from ancient Egypt itself. This is also from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And you see these two officials sitting with a laden table before them with some of these very leeks, some melons, grapes, meat, eggs, some other things. It's really kind of cool to see how important this is. Now, what exactly was it that we were complaining about? Miracles, of course. God sends us miraculous food from the heaven, man, lechem min hashamayim, and that's the thing we complain about. Now, what I would like to talk about is its representation. What did it look like, that is? Haman looks like deragad, a coriander seed. Now, I'm not going into too much about the man. I'm just going to mention that if this is the proper identification, we have an idea more or less of sort of what the man looked like. Next highlight. Finally, we come to the momentous occasion, one of the most impactful events in Jewish history, or ancient Jewish history, and that is Chet HaMeraglim, the sin of the spies. Now, the reason I say that this is one of the most important events in ancient Jewish history is because of its impact on Jewish history. First of all, an entire generation died. Second, instead of going straight into Eretz Yisrael, we needed to wait for another 38 years until 40 years from Yetziat Mitzrayim were completed. But there is a midrashic element which says that it's the bechiyah shel chinam, it's the crying at that night which led to the destruction of the first and second Bet HaMikdash and many more destructions to come. Because if we cried for no reason for losing Eretz Yisrael when there's no reason to believe we actually lost it, atem bechitem bechiyah shel chinam, ani ekba lachem bechiyah ledorot. Chazal say that God tells them, you cried for no reason, let me give you a reason to cry about. But there's a flip side. There's a good part to the story, and that is that the story shows you the fruits of the land of Eretz Yisrael. And it's that imagery which I would like to focus on in terms of history and archaeology and some really cool stuff. There are several modern Jewish or Israeli institutions which use that exact imagery of two meraglim holding the geffen, holding this big, luscious cluster of grapes. The first one is the Carmel Winery, founded in 1882 with the support of Sir Edmund de Rothschild. What is the significance of the year 1882? Well, the Yemenite Aliyah of 1882 was based on the Gematria Amarti E'ele Bet Tamar, Ochaza Besansinav. I will make Aliyah in the year Tafresh Mem Bet Tamar, that's 1882. But in addition, this is what's known as the first Aliyah, or the first modern Zionist Aliyah. Now, I'm aware of the politics and the story behind the propaganda, and was it the first Aliyah, was it not? There's an agenda, not getting into that. But the point is that this is when it was founded, and they use that imagery because it has to do with the beauty of the land. And speaking of wineries, we're going to get to more wineries later. But these meraglim came latur et haaretz, to tour the land, the modern Hebrew word for tourism. And so, of course, Misrad HaTayarut, the Ministry of Tourism, who recently sort of redid their icon, as many people do, but this is more or less along the original lines. You have the meraglim. Now, this image in the background from Olam HaTanach is an image of Israel's Negev south, or the desert identified as Midbar Tzin, and we're going from here into Kadesh Barnea. The Meraglim traveled in a very simple route. They went from Kadesh Barnea, the southern border of Eretz Yisrael, going up the heights of the Negev, Vaya'alu b'Negev v'yavo ad Chevron. There we have the Midrash of Kalev praying on Kivrei Avot, and they go all the way to the north to Hamat, and then they come back, give us the announcement when they cross back into Midbar Tzin from Kadesh Barnea. Let's go to Kadesh Barnea. Kadesh Barnea has a fortress from the Iron Age or the First Temple period, many different things to see there in terms of material culture, which tell us about the period of time. But I want to focus just on one detail, which I hope to get back to later, and that is that there is a destruction layer from the time of the campaign of Shoshenk, or Paro Sheshak, who invaded Israel and caused tremendous amount of damage to many cities in the time of the king of Rehovam, the 5th year of Rehovam, the son of Shlomo HaMelech. So I hope to be able to get back to that when we talk about it in Melachim Aleph. But now let's go to modern Kadesh Barnea. So here is our Google map, and there is Kadesh Barnea. And in Kadesh Barnea, in the heights of the Negev, Vaya'alu ze b'Negev v'yavo ad Chevron, there is a winery which is called Ramat Negev, the Negev Heights. So you have Golan Heights Winery, you have Negev Heights Winery. Now, I love this winery. First of all, their wine is really, really great, and they have a whole line of products, not only wine. They make olive oil, they make honey, but their wine is a very good wine for their price point, and we have a lovely family connection to this wine because the wine, Ramat Negev, this one is called Kadesh Barnea. Now, not only is there this history behind it, the connection to Latur Ta'aretz and tourism and coming into the land, but my father's name is Barnea, and he's a tour guide. So this is one of our family favorite wines. So that was a winery which I'm going to promote, and the reason I'm just promoting wineries in general is because the Meraglim caused so much damage and devastation by speaking badly about the land. That's the last thing I'm going to do. So I'm going to tell you, get that wine from Eretz Yisrael, Tovah ha'aretz me'od me'od. Next highlight. So the last part of the Chumash is about the encounter with the nations to the south and east of Eretz Canaan, the east of the Jordan, the Transjordan, known as Ever HaYarden. Now, a very important landmark in Ever HaYarden is known as Nachal Arnon, the Arnon River. Now, the Arnon River is basically the catchment basin, or you can say the runway, for many, many different rivers in the area of Moab and Jordan, and it's one of the largest and most important rivers east of the Jordan. It's a powerful stream, and it goes through all kinds of jagged ravines and pours into the Dead Sea in Ras El Ur, which is across from Ein Gedi. So this fits into the song, the Shira of Nachal Arnon, which, by the way, is where my name Nachliel comes from, because that has to do with the song there when we were saved, and so a lot of family history in this Chumash and in this particular area. Anyway, so let's get into the story really, really briefly of what happens in Ever HaYarden. I just highlighted Nachal Arnon there, which was, especially in the time of the First Temple period, the border between Israel and Moab. Now, before we get into archaeology, which has to do with Moab, I just want to go basically over the geography. So first of all, we encounter Edom, who is Esav, who is our brother. We are told, Al titgar b'milchama, do not provoke them. We move on to our cousins, Moab and Ammon. Ammon and Moab are from the children of Lot, who is the nephew of Abraham. No go, don't fight them. But then we go to Sihon Melech HaEmori, and then we go to Og Melech HaBashan, and these are the first conquests that we make, which end up becoming retroactively part of Eretz Canaan, even though they are across the Jordan, they're Ever HaYarden, and as we know, they were populated by Reuven, Gad, and half of Shevet Menashe. But that being said, I would like to focus on one character from archaeology, and that has to do with the king of Moab. There is only one inscription, as far as I can remember, which has Moabit on it, even though it's very, very similar to Hebrew, some sort of Hebrew Aramaic dialect, and it was found in the Transjordan in Moab. Now, it's a name of a king of Moab, which we know from Melachim Bet Perek Gimel, whose name is Meisha Melech Moab, and this is currently displayed in the Louvre. Now, hopefully we'll talk about this more when we get to Melachim Bet. I just want to mention that there is the name of a Moabite king who also mentions the existence of the tribe of Gad, Shevet Gad, living in particular cities that we know of from the Transjordan, named in these places. And according to a more recent interpretation, there may even be the mention of Bet David. That is up for academic debate, but it is mentioned, and that's really, really cool to know that Melech Moab is mentioned in archaeology. Next highlight. One of my favorites, perhaps, is to talk about snakes, not only because of Harry Potter and in general because of mythology, but just because snakes are really, really cool. Now, snakes are very dangerous, they're venomous, they're vicious, they're the symbol of Lashon Hara, but in addition to that, they're also the symbol of health. And so the image on the left of a winged staff with two intertwined snakes, known as the caduceus, is the image of the American Health Association, and it's known in America as a symbol of health, and also throughout the world there's different variations of a staff with snake. Now this caduceus actually comes from Greek mythology. This caduceus is the staff of Hermes, who's a messenger god in Greek mythology. In addition to that, they sometimes use the staff with a serpent, which comes from Asclepius, who is a Greek god associated with healing and medicine. But I want to focus specifically on the story of the Nechashim, in which Moshe Rabbeinu was supposed to respond to the attack of these serpents and snakes by making a serpent, a copper snake, on a standard, on a nes, which we were all supposed to look at. And according to the Mishnah, according to Chazal, if you pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when you look at it, then you are saved. It's really not about the snake, it's more about praying to God. And this is going to be very important for a discussion we're going to have in just a few moments. This is a picture I took 20 years ago as of today, in the year 2000, in Har Nebo. It's right there by the outlook into Eretz Canaan, which presumably is where Moshe Rabbeinu stood to look at Eretz Canaan before he died. So this is a symbolic, nice, touristy one that's there for you to take pictures of. It's very, very famous. But this worship of serpents and the hope that worshiping them will bring you health is very well rooted in ancient Near Eastern ritual. The one on the bottom left here is actually a gold-plated copper serpent found in the copper mines of Timnah. The one on the right here, I believe, was found in Megiddo, and the other one may have been found in Tel Arad. I'm not sure, maybe in Chatzor, I don't remember. But the point is that many different copper serpents and other representations of serpents on copper and so on have been found in Eretz Canaan. And the word Nachash and Nechoshet, copper and snake, are not interchangeable as a coincidence. So we need to keep that in mind. Now, it was mentioned that we're going to get back to speaking about the worship of serpents in the time of the first Beit HaMikdash, in the Iron Age. It mentions that Chizkiyahu was mechatet nechash nechoshet. Chizkiyahu took that copper snake and destroyed it, the one from Moshe Rabbeinu, because I guess people turned it into some sort of god. They deified it. But what it mentions about Chizkiyahu HaMelech is that there was the worship of Nehushtan, this sort of copper snake god. Now, this Mizbeach from Tel Sheva, from Israel South, which is from a Jewish city from the time, more or less, is a demonstration of how people made a Mizbeach, which is a Bama, which is already worshipping Hashem outside of the Beit HaMikdash, as we mentioned in Vayikra. And there's a carving of two snakes, or lightning bolt, depending how you interpret it, but there's a carving of two snakes on it, and some archaeologists suggest that this is actually an example of Nehushtan. And this is in the entrance to the archaeology gallery in the Israel Museum. Next highlight is going to be Bil'am ben Be'or. The end of the Torah says, Lo kamod be'Yisrael ke Moshe. There has been no prophet in Israel like Moshe. Aval be'umot ken kam, Chazal say. There was a prophet for the nations. And that is none other than Bil'am ben Be'or. Bil'am, the prophet, son of Be'or. Now, after the Six-Day War in 1967, there was an excavation to the northeast of the Dead Sea in a place called Dir El Allah, or Biblical Sukkot, which is part of Yaakov Avinu crossing back into Eretz Yisrael when he comes back from Haran. He goes to Sukkot, then goes to Shechem. So it's in that neighborhood. And what they found there in an ancient, probably a temple structure of some sort, because everything ancient is temple or ritual, right? They found a plaque made of plaster, which had writing on it in black and red ink, which is currently in the museum in Amman. I got to see that as well when I was there 20 years ago. And it mentions a Bil'am bar Be'or, in one word, bar Be'or. Bil'am, son of Be'or, in some sort of ancient Aramaic dialect. Now what's really cool is to see, this is presumably a copy of something older, is to see how impactful Bil'am was, that his prophecies, and this is a particular prophecy about a hex of some sort, bewitching someone, was copied and maintained for hundreds of years after his death. Another archaeology highlight. But last but not least, Achronot Chavivot, is Benot Tzlofchad, the daughters of Tzlofchad. Now this has to do with the laws of Yerusha, of inheritance of Eretz Yisrael, and generally speaking, the laws of inheritance is that the land that you get for your shevet goes down in your family through the male bloodline, through the men. Now, what happens if you only have daughters? the daughters of Tzlofchad, are coming to Moshe Rabbeinu with this claim, saying, listen, what about us? And so we get into the laws of inheritance. Now, these are daughters of Tzlofchad, who comes from the Shevet of Menashe. And what I would like to point out to you, that in the census of Menashe, which includes Bnot Tzlofchad, but many others, there are names which we find when we excavate the Nachala of Menashe in the city of Shomron. Shomron was the capital of the kingdom of the 10 tribes, the kingdom of Israel, founded by Omri. In Shomron, we found a whole lot of ostraca, which is plural for ostracon, which is just clay written on with some ink. Just like you would have empty papers in a book back in the day when paper was valuable, you would just use the paper anyway because, hey, paper. So you have broken sherds of clay from some vessel. Hey, clay, I can write on this. And so we found a whole lot of clay. Now, these ostraca were basically receipts for orders of wine or oil. Remember, Shomron's the capital. There's a lot of business going on there. And this is from hundreds of years after our story. But what's beautiful about it is that in these ancient Hebrew ostraca, it mentions names which we find in the census, in the count of the children of Menashe. And two of those several names that have been found are Noah and Hogla, two of the 5 daughters of Tzlofchad. Isn't that cool to find those names in the Nachala of Menashe lasting hundreds of years later? So it would say from, this is a receipt, mi Noah, mi Hogla, mi maybe Chilkiah or so on, mi Shemida. But that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you subscribe, like this video, comment on the video, come back for more, and follow Tanach Study and Sefer Study on all social media platforms, and listen to our podcast, Parashat Study Plus as well, and any way you listen to podcasts. I'm Nachliel Selavan, and thank you for watching.